Hello and welcome to week 1 of our program. In this module, we're going to be talking about some of the foundational elements of strategy. For our objectives, we're going to be spending some time talking about how you can develop your competence as a strategic leader. We're also going to be talking about some of the foundational elements of how we define industry dynamic and competitive advantage. I want to also spend some time talking about the program that we're going to be using, the framework, if you will, for our class. That's the AFI framework. Once we complete this PowerPoint, we're going to move you into the mission, vision, and values. We'll better understand it from a company point of view as well as for your strategic leadership plan. We're going to take a quiz just to make sure that we're reading everything we need to and remembering it. And then finally, we'll complete the discussion board, which will give you another opportunity to reflect on strategic leadership. In our introduction slide, we had an opportunity to talk about some definitions that we have for strategy. I would define strategy as a set of actions that managers take to increase their company's performance relative to industry rivals. So strategy is the move managers make to help achieve a sustained competitive advantage. So what we're seeing is our action, and then the competitor's reaction, and our action again, and that reaction. And that loop is how we define competitive advantage. Strategic management process, then, is the process by which managers choose a set of strategies that will allow the company to achieve superior performance. So how do we get competitive advantage? Well, it has to come from two places. Either we perform different activities or we perform the same activities, but we perform them differently than other rivals. For example, for Walmart, it's a big box store, but its strategic activities are focused to strengthen its role as a cost leader. It has low overhead, low wages. It makes sure that its logistics system is also very timely, that supports that cost leadership role. Strategy is not grandiose statements. For example, we will be number one. One of the great ways to identify a strategy is to look at companies and understand what actions they took as their market changed. Good example of this is Blockbusters. In this case, they didn't address some of the challenges that their competitors are bringing to the market. Netflix eventually moved to online. Amazon Prime took that to the next step, and Hulu even further. And so we see Blockbuster not meeting what was going on for the industry itself, but also not meeting new customer needs. So our strategic positioning requires us to take some trade-offs. We have to make conscious trade-offs about how we're going to allocate resources, what activities we will pursue, equally important, what activities we will not pursue. For example, Walmart, as we mentioned earlier, is a cost leader. And that's different from a company like Nordstrom, which hires professional salespeople and tries to create a luxury setting. There are a number of frameworks in our industry. However, we're going to focus for our class on a framework called the Analysis, Formulation, and Implementation Framework, AFI. Analysis, where we diagnose the competitive challenge. You'll be doing something similar when you do your group project. The formulation, a guiding policy to help address the competitive challenge. Recommendations, those will be taking part as part of your project as well. And then a set of coherent actions to implement the firm's guiding policy. We won't have the opportunity to include that in our project because of our time constraint. This slide is a summary of the AFI framework, and you'll find it in your book. I'm also going to include this as a separate sheet in our week 1 materials. It's an important framework because it helps us see at a big picture what we'll be covering. For example, in this week, we're looking at part 1 of the analysis, getting started, understanding what is strategy, and thinking about what are strategic leaders doing. In week 2, we'll be looking at the detail of external and internal analysis. We'll look at specific examples. You'll need that when you put your proposal together to identify exactly what analyses you're going to be completing. And I'll also forward to you a list of other resources you can have that will give you ideas beyond our textbook in terms of analysis you can complete. I'll come back to this framework each time we meet for our weeks so that it's organizing how you're thinking about the individual steps that we're taking. So the first part of analysis is to diagnose what's going on in the market. What's the competitive challenge that the organization is facing? We're going to look outward. When we're looking at our SWOT, it's the OT part of the SWOT, opportunities and threats. We also want to understand the firm's internal market. What's going on within that environment? Are we operating our resources in the way that's going to help us be most competitive? And that's the SW part of the SWOT, strengths and weaknesses. In the formulation phase of strategy, we're looking at the overall policy. We understand what markets we're going to be playing in and what our products will be. We are therefore, in our formulation, thinking about what are our strategic commitments? What investments are we going to be making? What changes are we making in terms of our resources? When we're looking at implementation, we're identifying a set of coherent steps with a clear connection to our logic of the strategy overall. One of the best books on this is The 4 Disciplines of Execution, and in week 6 we'll be talking about some of the best practices associated with that. We've been using the term competitive advantage. What do we mean by that? A company is said to have a competitive advantage when its profitability is greater than the average profitability of all firms in the industry. A competitive advantage is considered sustained when it's maintained for several years. It's worth noting that it's hard to continue to sustain competitive advantage. Sometimes students think that strategy just comes from senior leaders, but an effective strategy process includes all elements of the organization. We need feedback from frontline managers, employees, and customers, or any other end user of the firm in order to make sure we have good information to set that strategy. The best firms have an integrated process where they're continuously getting feedback from all levels of the organization. As we look at all the pieces that fit into our strategy, we'll create something called a balanced scorecard. Think of it as a dashboard that helps us identify how we're doing in each one of the critical elements for our strategy. We'll talk more about that in future weeks. I want to spend a few minutes and talk about the difference between strategy versus planning. Bill Barr highlighted this in the video that you saw when he talked about how corporations must plan and do plan, but the plans are often budgets and goals. Strategy is the logic that drives the action. So when we make a plan, we have these goals and steps that we want to take. However, the world is full of great uncertainty, and so we want to have an organizing logic that will help orient our actions towards supporting the overall strategy. And as Bill Barr said, the lesson, of course, is that we must plan, but we don't let budget and goals substitute for strategy. Build your strategy into a planning process so that everyone shares that common logic that guides their actions. Bill Barr is famous for his work on what he calls Red Queen competition. Red Queen competition is from Alice in Wonderland. Let's listen to the element of Alice in Wonderland that connected with Bill Barr as he thought about hyper competition.
In Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, Alice realizes she's living in a game, an enormous chessboard, and she wants to get to the 8th square.
When you reach the 8th square of the
The
chessboard,
Red Queen grabs Alice's hand and runs incredibly fast with her, until Alice realizes they haven't gone anywhere at all.
Faster! Faster! I don't understand! Don't try to talk! Faster! Faster! You may rest a little now. We haven't gotten anywhere. If you wanted to get anywhere, you'd have to run twice as fast as you did.
William Barnett argues that this phenomenon, having to run super fast just to stay in the same place, happens in business too. And without competition, the innovation game starts to fall apart.
Bill Barnett is talking about markets that are dynamic, where we constantly see shifts and change. And increasingly, that's what most firms face now. So we have to think about how we can gather information even faster, how we can create dynamic strategies, things that will change. We'll be talking about some of those tools in our program as well. Generally, when a firm is dealing with a predictable market, we can be planful. We can put those plans together after evaluation and execute it. At the heart of this is understanding that a good strategy is really the fit for the market. One of the less understood elements of Red Queen competition, or dynamic markets, is the opportunity for our employees to understand and learn through competitive interaction. When we outsource key components in order to meet dynamic strategy, our employees lose the opportunity to learn how to react to competitors, and that could cost us in the longer term. Bill Barnett calls this organizational evolution, and it can be the most valuable capability of the firm. He cautions that rather than trying to predict the future, we need to design a system that will help shape the future, that will help us be aware of those changing requirements on an ongoing basis. We need to build strategic thinking, therefore, at all levels of the organization. Some of the other tools that can help us plan for the future of a competitive environment is scenario planning. In other words, creating what-if scenarios about the future. As I mentioned, decentralizing planning so that all managers are incorporated into the planning process. And thinking about new resources and capabilities, creating a small team that focuses in on that strategic intent, exploiting future opportunities. For our personal strategic leadership development this week, we are going to be creating our own mission and vision statement. We'll also look at values and what things are important to us. With that in mind, we're going to wrap up the presentation right now, but continue on through the material that will give you more information about mission and vision. To do this, you'll want to click the bottom right button next, and it'll take you through the sequence of steps. You'll even have an opportunity to do some matching to see if you can figure out what company has which mission and vision. Don't worry, it's not something that's graded. It's just a completion. So once you've completed it, it'll show me in the grade book that that element is done. Continue clicking next throughout our material so that you can walk through all of the next steps. Again, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll look forward to seeing you in week 2.